having to create their own proprietary miniature OLED display technology, just so they could fit one of them under each one of these transparent keys, which they did by working with a Taiwanese supplier called iDisplay. And somehow, after all of that, they actually managed to ship a working product in 2008. Sadly, they got too caught up in the hype themselves. This company became so obsessed with achieving this goal of 113 OLED displays that they forgot to actually make the typing experience good. These keys have such high resistance that you're just tired after like a minute of using it. Oh yeah, and the thing was priced at $1,500 when it launched. So only a very small fraction of the people who first expressed interest actually followed through and bought the thing. I'm only going to give this a 2 out of 10 fail though, because there was a silver lining. Remember iDisplay? Well, they put so much time and effort into helping to create this mini under-keyboard OLED tech that they decided to run with it anyway, and they were eventually purchased by Elgato, which is what led to the Elgato Stream Deck, which even today is one of the must-have gadgets for any streamer. But not every story has a happy ending. Some of them have a nappy ending. This is Paul and Rachel Barron, who, after being completely unable to find a washable swim nappy for their son that was actually good and actually fit, decided to make their own. They started a company called Bow and Bell Littles, selling them on Amazon, and very quickly hit $1 million in sales. These guys were killing it. They were appearing on shows, they were being profiled by Forbes. But 4 years ago, possibly the absolute worst thing that could have happened. Amazon, you know, the nearly $2 trillion technology company, sent one customer a used diaper. And you bet that customer left a review. The diaper arrived used and was covered in poop stains. Nothing could have been more disgusting. These were not small stains either. I was extremely grossed out. Now, this sticky situation was nothing to do with the Barons. This happened because the person at Amazon responsible for checking returned products before sending them out to new customers did a pants job. But the worst part of this is, after the Barons saw this review and they scurried to tell Amazon that it wasn't their fault, that it could very heavily damage their business and to take it down, Amazon refused. And the Barons were right. This one review did completely tank their business. 4 years later, they're now $600,000 in debt, including a loan that has their house up as collateral. It's only after Bloomberg published an article about the whole debacle that Amazon finally agreed to take the review down. But the damage was already done. So 4 out of 10 fail, made worse by the fact that it wasn't even these guys' fault. So if you ever find yourself in the market for a washable swim nappy, now you know where to go. Just maybe don't return it after you've used it. Okay, we've seen all sorts of laptops over the years. Super high-end gaming laptops, super affordable $400 laptops. But what on earth does a $100 laptop look like? Well, in 2005, the founder of the MIT Media Lab, Nicholas Negroponte, formed One Laptop Per Child, a non-profit whose goal was to transform education in the developing world by creating and distributing as many devices as possible to children in schools. And the device that was going to change children's lives? The XO, a quirky little green plastic laptop designed to be produced as cheaply as possible while still giving disadvantaged kids access to a computer. And this thing had a lot of thoughtful features packed into it for its tiny cost, especially considering this was 2005. A hand crank that would allow children to power their device even if they didn't have access to an electrical outlet, which means that the device ran on a tiny fraction of the power of probably whatever you're watching this on, and that was crucial to allow kids to use it outside of school. The screen could flip around to turn it into an e-reader. The thing was made of shock-absorbing plastic and rubber, a feature that Negroponte clearly very much enjoyed showing off. A rubberized spill-proof keyboard, as well as all the ports being covered by the Wi-Fi antennae when closed, all with a logo in various colors so that kids could tell their laptops apart. And the absolute core of the whole thing was that the device ran on a Linux-based operating system, giving kids total access to the computer. The organization actually managed to gather so much steam that they were even offered free macOS licenses by Steve Jobs himself, which that never happens. But Negroponte turned them down just to keep the system as open as possible. All this for only $100. And they didn't even want to stop there. We really believe that we can make literally hundreds of millions of these machines available to children around the world, Negroponte promised. And it's not just $100, it's going to go lower. If you're thinking this is all too good to be true, good instincts. And people started to pick up on this when the crank broke off at the live demo. Not a great start. And by the time the laptop actually came out, a lot of these promises had just mysteriously vanished. There was no crank, although I guess you can kind of see why. It wasn't as durable as promised. The SSD only had 1 GB of storage. The screen was terrible. And the worst part of it was this whole project was geared around this being the $100 laptop. But even with all of these quality cuts, they only managed to get the launch price down to $130, which then went up to $180 in the next revision. So by the end of this, all the critics were convinced that the money that had been put into this project would have been far better spent on things that people in developing nations actually want and need, like, you know, better schools and clean drinking water. 4 out of 10 fail. Now, do you remember this little guy? This, alongside the Humane AI pin, were literally supposed to be the next step in the evolution of personal tech, after the smartphone, thanks to something called the Large Action Model, an AI system that can not just talk to you, but also perform actions based on what you say. Like, for example, communicate completely on your behalf with flights and hotels to book your entire holiday from just you saying a couple of words, which excited enough people to make $10 million in the first 5 days alone. But spoiler alert, no one would ever trust it to do that, because the Rabbit R1 sucks. The battery sucks, it requires its own SIM card if you want to use it on the go, and this thing suffered from some major security vulnerabilities from launch that Rabbit basically ignored. But the most fundamental, it wasn't needed. Everything this thing does can already be done completely on your smartphone, as well as a whole load of things that this can't, which led a lot of people to ask the question, sure, the teenage engineering design device housing does look really cool, but shouldn't this just be an app? Well, turns out it actually is. Android authorities Mishal Rahman managed to download Rabbit's Launcher APK onto a Google Pixel 6a and got it to run the entire R1 experience, which really does make this device the final boss of this meeting could have been an email. And in a similar vein of companies biting off more than they could chew, oh my god. You know Hewlett-Packard, or HP? If so, in all likelihood it's because you've used one of their PCs in your school computer room or the library, because they're affordable and they do the job. They're not exactly the company you think of as the front runners of consumer technology. However, in 2011, 1 year after the release of the iPad, HP decided it was their time to shine. They wanted to take on Apple with the HP Touchpad. And HP weren't stupid enough to just try and beat Apple at their own game. They promised something different. Because their tablet used the WebOS operating system, built on the same tech as a lot of web browsers, the touchpad promised to be a more open and customizable experience than Apple's walled garden approach, while also maintaining some of the style and flair that Apple's known for, which I think is fair to say was lacking in most Android devices at the time. And because WebOS was based on common web technology, it was supposed to be super developer-friendly too. Now this was a very expensive move, because HP had to acquire Palm, who made WebOS for, close your eyes, $1.2 billion. So I'm sure everyone at the company was just praying that this would pay off. Oh god, there is absolutely no competition between how slick and intuitive the iPad interface is versus this. The touchpad was pretty universally recognized as a much slower, much clunkier, and significantly bulkier iPad. Nobody wanted this thing. And do you know what makes it particularly embarrassing? The HP was already worse than the original iPad, with it being so buggy on top of everything else. But to finish it all off, by the time this touchpad had actually come out, Apple had just launched this, the iPad 2, which absolutely decimated the thing. This product was performing so poorly, both in terms of sales and customer experience, even after slashing the price by $100, that HP literally took it off the market after only 48 days. They even had to refund retailers for the stock they'd purchased, practically soiling everyone's perception of the whole company, while burning through a hell of a lot of cash while they were at it. 5 out of 10. Now, for number 7, we actually have to go all the way back to 1988, before the World Wide Web, if you can even imagine such a thing. We're talking about a time where only 60,000 computers across fewer than 20 countries were connected to the internet, which was only used by universities, research centers, and government bodies. But then in November that year, a malicious, self-replicating worm program was released from a computer at MIT, and 24 hours later, 6,000 of those 60,000 computers had been infected. And let's be very clear, computers in very important places, including major universities like Berkeley and Harvard, and even NASA. The worm used a backdoor in the email systems to get into these computers, which wasn't very hard. Computers at this stage, they were not ready for internet trolls. And while it didn't destroy any files, it rendered those systems practically unusable. Emails were delayed for days, and functions at vital institutions, including, by the way, the military, were blocked, leading to all sorts of key infrastructure having to either wipe their systems or take them offline for over a week in an attempt to rid themselves of the worm. We are talking up to millions of dollars of damage, with obviously the potential for much bigger consequences. Here's where it gets really interesting. Seeing the damage it had caused, an anonymous programmer admitted to two friends that he was the one who'd created the worm, but that he hadn't intended it to spiral this much out of control. He asked one of the friends to send an anonymous message across the internet, which included both his apologies and instructions on how to remove the worm, but ironically, few people actually saw this because of the extent of the network damage. The other friend went to the New York Times to try and do some damage control, telling them that the worm was meant to be a harmless experiment, but accidentally revealed the programmer's identity by, well, it wasn't very smart, using his initials, which were easily searchable at his university. So, the New York Times found and outed the culprit, 23-year-old Robert Tappan Morris. And then the FBI got involved. They quickly launched an investigation and found plenty of incriminating evidence, which was used to prosecute him in 1989. And the reason this was so momentous is that Morris was the first person to ever be indicted under US Congress's new 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Silver lining though, this was the wake-up call for global cybersecurity. Only a few days after this attack, the US Department of Defense set up America's first computer emergency response team in Pittsburgh. And now that they've woken up, here is how Bitdefender's new Scam Copilot, our sponsor, can help you to avoid the same embarrassment. So, this right here is a scam website. They steal your data, they take your money, and you don't get the products you've paid for. But equally, how on earth would you know? This is how. So my phone has the Bitdefender Scam Copilot baked into it, which means that when I try and load up that same page, it will stop me. Dangerous page blocked for your protection. And it's not just for your browser, this thing protects everything. Like for example, Bitdefender now pre-checks every single email and text as they come in for scams and phishing attempts before I even need to think about clicking them. And there is a lot more, including a live chat that lets you check just about anything else that might look a little dodge that you're concerned about interacting with. Link below to get yourself the Bitdefender Scam Copilot. Now, at least the Morris worm issues were resolved in the end though. The Tesla Cybertruck, on the other hand, has just been one continuous rocky road of problems. Ever since its very inception, where the bulletproof windows smashed during a demo to show how bulletproof they were. But who would have thought that that wouldn't even be its biggest issue? Because now the thing's actually out, this thing has been recalled 5 times just this year. January for a warning light font size that was too small. Not something I ever considered before, but absolutely a real danger. Thankfully, they managed to fix this one remotely with an update. April for a dodgy accelerator pedal, which could dislodge from its pad if pushed too hard, getting stuck on the throttle, which if you think about it is as bad as an issue can get on a car. In June, Tesla had to issue 2 recalls on the same day because of faulty windshield wipers. I mean, who would have guessed that the Cybertruck's bizarre single 4-foot-long wiper might not work perfectly? It was failing due to excessive electrical current, requiring the entire motor to be replaced. And then one for the sail applique, the long strip of plastic lining on top of the sides of the bed, which was poorly installed on some vehicles, and has fallen off in at least 2 cases, creating a road hazard that very much has the potential to be deadly. And then finally, in October, due to a software issue that delays or prevents the rear view camera from showing you its feed. The result? Over 27,000 Cybertrucks have been recalled. That's basically every Cybertruck ever made. And as of July the 8th, Tesla has also been offering free motor replacements. They said it's not dangerous to drive with the old one, and they haven't officially called this a recall, but given that so far the Cybertruck has given people all the confidence of a wet paper bag with wheels on it, I don't know how many people are going to believe that. This smells like a 6 out of 10 bill to me. And now we're in the top 5. Now it just goes from bad to worse. Have you heard of Concord? I'm going to guess you haven't, and that's part of the problem. See, Concord is a video game that should have gone gangbusters. It was a hero shooter, one of the most popular genres in gaming history. It was developed by ex-Bungie staff, you know, the people who worked on the very successful Destiny 2. And it was a PlayStation Studios game, meaning that it's published by PlayStation themselves. And refreshingly, it was going to be a one-time $40 purchase with no battle pass or microtransactions. So what could go wrong? Well, as soon as the first trailer dropped, people immediately lost interest. And that includes me. I was watching the PlayStation event live when they announced this, like, what did I just see? Sure, we love a good hero shooter, but ever since Overwatch exploded onto the scene in 2016, the entire industry has just been pumping out clones of that game that basically do nothing new. So we're at a stage now in 2024 where people are very fatigued of the genre. But that's far from the full deal, because the character designs were boring and also particularly aesthetically unappealing, which sounds silly, but a genre like this actually needs players to want to look like the heroes they're playing as, especially since this entire genre revolves around unlockable skins that you want to be desirable to keep players playing. The 70s sci-fi aesthetic just wasn't resonating with kids who were born 30 years later, let alone the fact that it just made the entire world look like a knockoff Guardians of the Galaxy without the charm. And arguably the biggest problem, Sony really failed to market the game at all. Like, this first trailer was 3 months before the release of the game, which is probably why you've never heard of it. Even so, I don't think anyone expected just how badly this game would perform. Concord launched in August 2024, and want to guess how many concurrent players that it had at its absolute peak on Steam? To give you an idea, Counter-Strike 2 has nearly 2 million players. Concord? 697. And you know what makes it many times worse? Concord's been in development for 8 years. And you might be thinking, well, surely that means the game's going to be good. And according to reviews, it actually was at least fun to play. But what happened 8 years ago? Overwatch. This thing is so clearly yet another copycat trying to cash in on the genre, except unlike games like Paladins or Valorant, which have their own twists, this game took so long to make that it's both completely missed the hero shooter hype window, while being based on the Gen 1 product that in itself is now outdated. I mean, Overwatch 2 is already out now, and even that is struggling. But the single most embarrassing part of this misadventure is that Sony saw Concord's paltry player numbers and decided that instead of giving this game a chance, trying something new with the marketing, like, I don't know, just off the top of my head, telling people the game existed, that they would shut the servers down forever after 2 weeks of them being live. They invested a rumored $400 million into developing this thing, which would make Concord easily PlayStation's most expensive game ever. Even The Last of Us Part 2 only cost them $220 million, although there are other rumors saying that this was closer to $150 million. But either way, surely it was worth just risking a little bit extra just in case they could scrape some of that back. Easy 6 out of 10 disaster here. That didn't sound good. And now you can just get ready to lose all trust entirely in the ability of big companies to actually look after you, starting with the Snowflake hack. So, Snowflake is a high-security cloud storage provider with over 9,800 corporate customers, including giants like Santander, Ticketmaster, and AT&T. So all of these massive companies will store their customers' private data using Snowflake. And all 3 of those companies were affected when a hacking group compromised Snowflake in April. The hacker group, who call themselves the Shiny Hunters, which is another name for people who spend hundreds of hours in the Pokemon games searching for rare shiny versions of them, got straight into the company's Snowflake accounts, stole the data in them with the intention to sell that data off. They used info-stealing malware programs to infect systems not owned by Snowflake themselves, but likely devices owned by Snowflake's customers, companies like AT&T, who would often save their Snowflake login credentials on their own devices too. And honestly, this hack sounds like it was a whole lot easier to pull off than actually finding a shiny Pokemon. People need to remember that storing your data in a locked down server is fantastic, but it doesn't mean anything if the passwords to access that server are literally sitting on your desktop. Your security is only as good as the weakest link in your chain. And yet these fruitcakes didn't even enable 2-factor authentication on their machines. And the impact has been bad. The hackers got away with 1.3 terabytes of personal info from 560 million Ticketmaster accounts, including full names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, even payment card data, which they are selling for $500,000 on Breach Forums, a notorious cybercrime platform that they own. AT&T was hit even harder with info from, I quote, nearly all of their tens of millions of customers stolen, including which numbers those customers interacted with, counts of the texts and calls, and total call durations for specific days or months, the info from which absolutely can and very likely will be used to scam them, with tools on the internet also allowing you to find the names connected to those numbers. And this is the funniest part. AT&T has reportedly paid the group Shiny Hunters $370,000 to delete the data, the only proof of which comes from a video of the Shiny Hunters clicking the delete button, as if they aren't a criminal organization who hasn't already made a backup. I'm cringing just thinking about it. 7 out of 10 fail. So there's been a bunch of cyber attacks in this series, but when your network is down because of a hacker, you can at least blame it on them, even if it exploited a vulnerability that you should have fixed. However, you know what's a lot more embarrassing? is when you brick your own tech, let alone basically everyone else's. Do you remember in July when it felt like the entire world had a sudden IT crisis? Well, that's because of CrowdStrike, a cybersecurity company who makes products to protect Windows. And get this, over half of Fortune 500 companies rely on them. This is not a small potatoes company. However, on July 18th, CrowdStrike pushed a minor update for one of their products called Falcon, which is a cloud-based AI-powered malware protection platform, and it wreaked absolute havoc, sentencing some 8.5 million PCs around the world to the infamous blue screen of death. I'm talking banks, TV stations, airlines were down. Like, Delta alone had to cancel around 7,000 flights. Basically everyone who used Falcon. Hospitals were cancelling non-urgent surgeries, and even when stuff was running, it was often because people had resorted to doing things by hand, like this handwritten boarding pass for a flight in India. In certain parts of the US, even the emergency 911 number was down. And it's all because Falcon's little update, which happened all the time to keep up with new malware threats as the company learns about them, installed code onto people's Windows computers containing a logic error, which caused their devices to crash since they couldn't compute the impossible logic. And because the issue is happening on what's called the kernel level, i.e. accessing and editing the entire underlying system, not just the surface level stuff normal apps have access to, and because it was also a bootstrap driver, meaning it was required for the system to boot up at all, it was like the perfect cocktail to lock those PCs into an endless recovery loop. Fortunately, the fix turned out to be pretty simple. Just boot it into safe mode and delete the files associated with the problem. But because of how embedded it had become, in a lot of cases it required an IT professional to have physical access to the machine, meaning that recovery was slow for many organizations, with the disruptions causing a total of not millions, not tens of millions, but $5.4 billion in direct losses for companies. Ooh. But this one is straight up bonkers. So Mariner 1 was the US's first interplanetary space probe. It was designed to journey to Venus, equipped with various scientific instruments to allow it to record data. Spoiler alert, it didn't get there, and you're not going to believe how embarrassing the reason is. The thing was supposed to fly past Venus and use these sensors to collect data about the planet, keeping in contact with mission control for about 15 weeks total. But after all of the work that was put into designing and constructing the craft, which was composed of over 54,000 components, disaster struck. It successfully lifted off on July 22nd, 1962, flying nearly 100 miles upwards for 3.5 minutes until suddenly, randomly, it veered off course. So much so that they had to issue the self-destruct command to avoid a collision with ships in the North Atlantic. The reason it happened though? The hardware was absolutely fine. The culprit was an unbelievably easy to miss software error. A standard R was used in one equation when it should have been an R with an overbar. And the reason that's so important is that the guidance computer on board that's making sure the thing is on track is constantly checking in with its sensors. And the bar on top of the R is the symbol that makes sure it takes the average of those sensors instead of just taking one reading at face value. So without the correct R, the probe basically started to overcorrect its course in response to outlying data points that it should have been ignoring. The project cost them around $192 million in today's money, all thrown out the window because of a single typo. I mean, what's the most damage a typo has ever caused you? Could actually be pretty bad now I think about it. 8 out of 10 fail. The only slight saving grace being that they'd also already constructed Mariner 2, an identical probe, and because the fatal problem was a completely avoidable human error, they fixed it in about 4 seconds, and Mariner 2 was launched successfully just a month later, and was the reason that we now know Venus rotates in the opposite direction to Earth. But nothing beats the Y2K bug. Whoa. If you were born after 2000, this one's probably going to sound too insane to be true. Do you remember when everyone thought the world was going to end in 2012? Because that was the end of a 5,000-year cycle in the ancient Mayan calendar. Well, there was something just like that for the year 2000, only this one was grounded in the much more real fear of a tech apocalypse. Because it turns out that when complex computer systems were originally designed in the 60s, computer scientists figured that they'd save what pitiful storage and screen space that they had by using a 2-digit number for the year. We were very much in the 1900s after all. Years beginning with 18 were old news and 20 felt like too far away. The problem is, as the years ticked up and we got ever closer to the new millennium, people started to wonder, are computers actually going to understand that 00 means 2000, not 1900? And you might think that the only real consequence of that would be waking up on New Year's morning thinking, Hey, that's funny. The clock's just gone back 100 years. There were real reasons to be worried, because as you've seen with the Marina, small miscalculations with the input of a computer can have major consequences with the output. And in this case, industries that relied on computer-tracked dates could be affected in huge ways, like banks, which track interest daily, could potentially suddenly calculate interest at minus 99 years. And places like power plants, which track routine safety checks of things like radiation levels, could pose a threat to human life if these checks were missed. People even started panicking that planes might start falling from the sky and that people's pacemakers would just stop, that old Uncle Joe would just collapse and die the second that you go from one to Happy New Year at your party. So, governments raced to avert a potential computer crisis, rushing to update anything and everything to a 4-digit date. And I mean everything. I don't think anyone quite expected just how much would be spent on this. You know how some companies in this fails list have lost hundreds of millions? Here, an estimated $200 to $600 billion was spent to tackle the issue. And that's in the 1990s. And when you think about it, that is a catastrophic amount of money to burn, considering that it could have been avoided by a few computer scientists typing 2 more characters. 9 out of 10. Thankfully, the steps taken did avert widespread chaos, but the few issues that did still occur proved that the worry was warranted. For example, on January 1st, 2000, many computers did think they woke up in 1900, forcing 15 nuclear reactors across the world to shut down. Some people who did, in fact, incur 100-year bank loan interests, and hilariously, one customer at a New York video rental store who was handed a bill of $91,250. Yes, for having rented a movie for 100 years. Catch you in the next fails video, right here.
What needs revealing? Our time has come.
Fake products, false advertising, ruthless scams, these are the 13 most evil tech fails that through instant karma have completely backfired for the companies trying to make some quick cash, ranging from pretty naughty to pure diabolical. Starting with Nokia and their Lumia 920. In the phone's promotional material, this company decided that they really wanted to emphasize the power of the 920's optical image stabilization. So they created this situation where a guy was holding the phone on his bike and he was using the phone to record this girl on another bike. But viewers noticed something a little sinister later on in the video. The reflection of a person who was not the original cyclist holding the phone, but in fact a completely different guy standing in a van holding a proper heavy-duty film camera. And that's because the video wasn't really filmed on the 920. It was filmed on this, speculated to be a red cinema camera, which, I mean, those things are like minimum $10,000. Nokia faked the entire ad, and that's especially bad because this ad doesn't just vaguely imply that it was shot on the phone, it basically tells you that it was. Wait, how did you break? You can't do that in the age of the Reddit investigator, meaning that Nokia was forced to make a public apology and pretty much soil the reputation of their one remaining successful product line. It's all downhill from there. 3 out of 10. You can't beat the internet, and that's something that Netflix also had to learn in 2011. You might know that Netflix actually started off as an online DVD rent-by-mail service. So people would use the website to pick what they wanted to watch, and then the company would ship those out as discs alongside a prepaid return envelope. But then as soon as internet connections started improving, and people were also looking for alternatives to cable TV, Netflix also introduced the option for subscribers to just stream a smaller selection of the movies and TV shows in their library straight from their site, like we do now. And as Netflix's streaming business grew, and they found that, surprise, surprise, it was cheaper to run than manually going to the post office and mailing people discs, they needed to find a way to encourage people to choose that option. That's where they went wrong. In 2011, Netflix decided that they were going to split their streaming and DVD rental services, which were previously all included for one price, into not just 2 different tiers, but 2 separate companies entirely, renaming their DVD service to Quickster. It would involve users having to have 2 separate accounts, 2 separate websites to navigate, and also 2 separate fees to pay. The internet quickly came to the conclusion that keeping both subscriptions going after this split would result in a price hike of not 5% or 10%, but 60%, leading 800,000 users to not subscribe to both, but instead just cancel their existing subscriptions, causing Netflix's entire stock price to plunge to half of its value. Talk about net flops. It's a 4 out of 10 fail. And of course, Netflix had to back out of the plan with their tail between their legs after only a month. And this actually all remained one service until they completely stopped renting out DVDs last year. Yeah, they've still been doing it this whole time. But it can always get worse, as we're about to see with some increasingly immoral gaming fails. Do you remember when every video game studio was rushing to implement NFTs in their games? Companies realized that if they made their in-game items NFTs, then you could verify via the blockchain that they are well and truly one of a kind, which artificially increases their perceived value. And if you increase the value of your in-game items, well, that should drive more people to play your game for longer to earn them and create a marketplace where players could buy and sell them, with of course the developers taking a cut from each transaction. Oh my goodness. Wait, that's the actual smoke alarm. Can you just, oh god. EA is probably the most notorious company for bigging up NFTs. Not hugely surprising given they were voted worst company in America in 2013, but in recent years it has started to feel like Ubisoft is gunning for the title, because in 2021 they revealed their plans for playable NFTs in games through a service called Ubisoft Quartz, starting with Ghost Recon. However, because actually designing thousands of one-of-a-kind exclusive items would take Ubisoft a long time, they had a better idea. To give everyone the same item, with the unique twist being that each one had its own serial number, just like every other product you've ever bought in a shop. But what made it so much worse is that the entire game was designed around those NFTs, each requiring anywhere from 100 to 600 hours to earn, almost forcing players who wanted them, but still wanted to actually have a life, to take out their real wallets and pay. Thankfully, karma bites back. The trailer for Ubisoft Quartz was delisted on YouTube almost immediately after it shot up to 95% dislikes, and when the project eventually launched, it was such a colossal failure that it will never not be funny. The company likely lost millions in reputational damage from the move. How much did they make from the entirety of their NFT efforts? About $400. So they could buy about 7 copies of their own game. It's a 5 out of 10. But worse still is what happened to a game that I was personally really excited for. One of my favorite video games of all time, actually, is Star Wars Battlefront 2 on the PlayStation 2. This game is basically sacred for Star Wars fans. And so imagine our reaction when EA comes in and they say they're rebooting this exact game for the modern era in 2017, but with next-gen realism. I remember wanting to dial every single person in my contacts list just to tell them how big of a deal this was. We were all so caught up in excitement that the world almost completely forgot that it was EA designing this game, and thus the microtransaction-riddled mess that it would end up becoming. When the beta of the game dropped, if you wanted to make basically any progress at all, you would have to open up dozens upon dozens of completely randomized loot boxes until you got what you needed. And if you wanted to do that without spending a month literally glued to your television screen, you were gonna have to take out your wallet and spend real money. Now, it's one thing to have paid items in a game. It's a very different thing for those paid items to be randomized, and most importantly, to be crucial to actually winning. These boxes, they didn't just contain skins and cosmetics, genuinely game-changing character upgrades that were likely to be the difference between winning and losing. Players were not happy, and they made their voices heard. One player complained to EA that it was basically impossible to unlock Darth Vader, the most shameless character to put behind a paywall without paying real money. And yep, EA made it worse by responding to this by saying that the reason the characters were so expensive is because they wanted players to have a sense of accomplishment from getting them. And this super condescending, absolutely bold-faced lie completely blew up. It became such a big fiasco that even non-video game news sites were reporting on it. EA were actually taken to court by the Belgian Gaming Commission, accused of promoting gambling among underage players. And they've basically been arguing their case in court ever since. The game has improved, but no one has forgiven the company, to the point where new releases from the company are still being investigated as recently as 2023. Now, say what you want about Ubisoft and EA, at least they made the games that landed them on this list. The same can't be said for Raw. Raw was a massively multiplayer online life simulator that was promising enormous things. The initial trailer showed off entire towns with a full economy where every player has a job, can purchase property and vehicles, and take out contracts with other players. You can even become the mayor and govern your server. It basically looked like GTA Online, but with 100 times the number of complex systems and mechanics. The trailers were flashy and well animated, but it was all cinematics, not real gameplay. That said, it did not stop a lot of people from backing the project on Kickstarter, leading the game to easily surpass the nearly $80,000 that the company was asking for in funding. A lot of money? Absolutely. Enough to develop a game this sprawling? Not even close. What these guys were trying to do here would have cost tens of millions of dollars and needed 100 developers at a minimum. How many did they have? Two. They had two people. All signs were pointing towards scam, and they so nearly got away with it. But it was greed. It was trying to convince people that they were actually working on something, hoping they could squeeze out just a little bit more in Kickstarter funding. They made a fatal mistake. They released a gameplay trailer of the game that didn't exist. And as soon as the internet saw it, people immediately realized that the whole thing, from the furniture to the players running animation, were all stock assets, clearly just pulled together from the Unity asset store that people would use as a base to actually build a game upon. Kickstarter suspended their funding immediately and also slapped them with a fine of the total value of everything they'd raised so far. Now, you might have recently heard of the right to repair. The idea that as a consumer, you should be able to freely repair your own device rather than having to send it back to the manufacturer, who are basically guaranteed to charge you more than it costs. Looking at you, phone companies. But quite possibly the worst offender is the huge farm tech company John Deere, who started integrating engine control units into their equipment that, once they detect any problem at all, just shut down many of the engine's functions, requiring specific software and tools to fix. And where do you get those software and tools? Oh, you go to John Deere. Oh, that makes sense. This company was literally designing their products to make them purposefully difficult to repair, while also refusing to provide farmers or independent repair shops with the tools needed to do so, which stings even more than the whole right to repair drama with iPhones, because, let's be honest, practically no normal individual user is actually repairing their own phone, whereas in the case of farmers and their tractors, it's a very normal thing to fix it yourself. Oh, and your livelihood depends on it. You're going to miss your entire harvest waiting for John Deere to have to fix it. And that's not even accounting for the enormous bill you're going to get because of it. So, thankfully, the company is currently facing 2 class action lawsuits accusing them of monopolizing the industry. And given that their repair business makes them 3 to 6 times the profit that they make on actually selling their gear, it's looking less like John Deere, more like Oh Deere. Can you imagine how stressful it's been having to research this video to learn all the excruciating details of this evilness? The only thing that's got me through it is tabfulness. The serene, meditative state you enter in which it doesn't actually matter how many tabs of hair-pullingly evil tech fails there are open. Thanks to the organization, the grouping, and even the color coding of tabs in the Opera browser, you stay stress-free. The inner peace that descends when you're not being bombarded with stupid ads, you're not digging through endless pages, but you're getting instant answers from Aria, Opera's browser AI. We all face stressful things in our lives, but by downloading the Opera browser using the link in the description, you can at least find calm in your browser. Okay, it's time to delve deeper into the depths of tech hell with a returning guest. This is like the one series you don't want to be a regular on. On a past fails video, we talked about the sheer negligence of Boeing with their 737 MAX aircraft, the next generation of the most popular aircraft in history that, thanks to a whole number of poor decisions, crashed twice, leading to the deaths of hundreds of passengers. It was a catastrophe. And they've done it again, when on the 5th of January 2024, a Boeing 737 MAX aircraft flying from Portland to California had to return for an emergency landing shortly after taking off when the door came off. I mean, just imagine you're flying at 16,000 feet in the air, you're barely 5 minutes into Shrek 2 on your phone, when the door right next to the seats flies off into oblivion. Miraculously, only 7 seats in that plane were unoccupied, and 2 of those just so happened to be next to that door, meaning that somehow not a single person was seriously injured. But people lost their belongings. One person had his shirt sucked off his body, and if he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, there's a very good chance he would have gone with it. Side note, kind of incredibly, one phone that fell out of the plane, which looks to me like a 14 Pro, was actually found on the side of a road, still working after that drop. Yeah, as far as this 737 MAX is concerned, after this incident, with everyone being completely shocked that this could even happen to a plane that had just come off the production lines 2 months ago, around 170 of them were grounded so they could be inspected for potential issues with the doors. After which, both United and Alaska Airlines found multiple loose parts, including installation issues with the exact same door plug that had caused the accident in nearly 10 of their 79 Boeing planes. And then the Federal Aviation Administration found further manufacturing issues, all but forcing Boeing's CEO to have to admit to a lapse in quality control, which you could argue is not evil, it's just negligent. But then I think persistent negligence in the face of even potentially fatal consequences feels pretty corrupt to me. Oh, and the passengers of the Ontario flight are also suing them, leading this to be our first 6 out of 10 fail. Have you ever heard of BitConnect? There's a good chance you saw Or more likely heard this unstoppable moron in 2016 when the new cryptocurrency BitConnect first launched. Here's some advice that I think some people could have done with at the time. If someone is literally having to yell at you about how good their virtual coin is, don't buy it. If you take what they say at face value, BitConnect seems crazy profitable. Users were being promised a 1% return on their investment every single day, which, if you do the math, means that if you dropped so much as $1,000 on day one, then with it compounding every single day, by the end of 3 years, you would be on $50 million. The guy was basically promising people free money, and the crazy part of it was that it kind of worked. While the value of one BitConnect started out at $0.1, the sheer fever these guys managed to create around this coin, it rocketed the value all the way to a peak of 455. And then the authorities got involved. This was one of the first of what would become many crypto Ponzi schemes. Basically a scam where someone asks for an investment from you and then asks you to go and recruit even more investors. You get paid, but you're only getting paid because even more people are being lured into the trap from the bottom of the pyramid and investing their money too. And the problem with this is eventually the pyramid has to collapse because you can't keep finding bigger and bigger groups of new investors to support the growing weight from above. So yes, BitConnect was eventually forced to refund every single one of its investors, and over $50 million in crypto was seized from one of its founders. Ouch. 7 out of 10. But we're not always so lucky. Sometimes tech companies do something truly awful and they get away with it. So, just before number 5,
Harmony research complete. We await your command.
here's a quick fire round of the ones that got away. With the iPhone 14 launch, Apple really pushed the boundaries when they tried to sell the fact that they were using the exact same chipset for the iPhone 14 as they used for the iPhone 13 as a feature.
To iPhone 14.
When I saw this, my jaw hit the floor. CSGO Lotto was a website where people could gamble with real money for collectible weapon skins in the game Counter-Strike Global Offensive. The site came out of nowhere when it was suddenly massively promoted by 2 gaming YouTubers who kept posting videos of them winning big and encouraging their mostly younger viewers to get involved. And because it managed to carefully swerve gambling laws, there were no restrictions on under 18s joining in. Until it was revealed that these 2 YouTubers were the owners of the site. And they must have been making bank because they were exposed for paying other influencers up to $25,000 each to promote the site. But what happened when they got sued for promoting, well, gambling for children? Well, they literally got away with being told, don't do that again. Amazon is widely regarded as being the worst big tech company for how it treats its staff. In terms of stress, encouraging delivery drivers to make 150 plus stops in a single day, often causing them to skip meals and even bathroom breaks. In terms of safety, with ambulances having been called out over 1,000 times since 2018 in just the UK from Amazon warehouse staff. And in terms of just general ethics, with up to 18,000 workers recently fired in one go, most found out via an email. But up until this point, it hasn't caught up with them in any meaningful way. And then, while every taxation system around the world charges you more the more money you earn, the big 6 tech companies, Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Netflix, Apple, and Microsoft, have each individually managed to sneak their way out of it. By situating their headquarters in low-tax zones, even though those aren't the zones they're primarily operating in, they've managed to get away with paying just $219 billion in taxes between 2010 and 2020. Now that might sound like a lot, but these are the richest companies in the world, and that accounts for just 3.6% of their total revenue. For reference, people earning high amounts here in the UK pay 45%. Whew. Okay, if you're enjoying this video, then a sub to the channel would be wicked. Right, no more companies getting away. Now it's time for the top 5 companies who are truly evil and who got punished just as badly for it. Starting with WeWork, the company who practically invented the concept of buying out office buildings and then renting out individual floors and spaces to businesses and aspiring entrepreneurs. And WeWork generated a lot of buzz. It was great for networking, it was great for motivating people who would otherwise be sat in their parents' basements. It gave business people a more typical working life structure, which, as someone who works some pretty odd hours, I can see the benefit of. As could a lot of people. Because in fact, at its peak, WeWork was valued at an absolutely eye-watering, hard to even think about $48 billion. But nobody is immune to this series. And practically the sole reason WeWork failed is their extremely irresponsible CEO, Adam Neumann. This guy had something so good on his hands, but he just kept making unbelievably reckless decisions, like buying a $60 million private jet before the company had even gone public, investing heavily into a company that makes artificial wave pools, or like when Neumann changed the company's name from WeWork to We Company, which is a name he just so happened to have recently trademarked himself so that he could sell that name to the company, making $5.9 million in personal profits. But the final nail in the coffin came when WeWork eventually decided to go public. Now, when a company goes public and everyone starts buying shares, most CEOs, they tend to wait for this moment before selling their own shares to maximize the value. Neumann, for some reason, decided to take out his entire $700 million in stock basically the night before, meaning that at the point where WeWork actually became available to buy, their now public stats just showed enormous losses, which does not work. Neumann's continued poor leadership, it got this company to a stage where they were so poor, they couldn't even afford to fire their employees, leading to him asked to resign as CEO. WeWork is still around, but it hasn't got even close to their dizzying original valuation since. But some fails stem from nobler goals than just trying to make a quick buck, like, for instance, trying to solve world hunger. Like when scientists at MIT's Media Lab developed what they were calling the food computer, basically a pod designed to grow perfect crops with LEDs, sensors, pumps, and precision machine learning algorithms constantly tweaking the internal climate. The idea was to sell thousands of these things to farmers to create massive agricultural servers, which would allow anyone to grow anything and absolutely revolutionize farming as we know it. They even announced that they'd already started sending units to a refugee camp, which could really help people. Except they hadn't. It turned out the project lead, Caleb Harper, was just straight up lying about that for publicity. And it turned out that wasn't the only thing he was lying about. Because in 2020 it came to light that the food computer itself didn't even work in the first place. This guy had gone as far as to get his team to go out and buy potted plants from a store, plant them in the computers, and pass them off as specimens that had been grown from scratch from inside the devices. MIT obviously fired Harper and shuttered the project immediately, but it just gets worse because it turns out that the project had also been polluting the local water supply with toxic nitrogen-infused wastewater the whole time, so MIT were fined too. But I can't think of a more continuous lapse in judgment than what happened recently with Reddit. On April 18th, 2023, Reddit announced changes to their data policies so they could monetize their data better. Essentially, before this happened, a lot of tools will be able to freely access Reddit's data, which means moderators who look after the various communities could create tools that help them to actively approve and reject posts as they come in, that a lot of users were free to use third-party tools to browse Reddit in a more organized, efficient way, and also that Reddit had become like the perfect place to train new AI models, because it's just 18 years of pure human conversation. So if you ever wanted to build an AI that talks like us and thinks like us, then it's a goldmine. And this arrangement worked out quite well. Almost all these moderators were basically doing Reddit's work for them for free. Reddit was earning healthy amounts of cash via the ad revenue from the site, and the platform was also just doing a general service for the internet. But Reddit didn't like that. They decided that they wanted to start charging for the use of their data, partly to obviously make more money immediately, but partly because they knew this would also allow them to charge the third-party Reddit clients like Apollo, which, since they have to access Reddit data to work, bucket loads of cash. Like in the case of Apollo, these charges would literally have cost the app $20 million per year in data charges. So they were forced to shut down. Remember, this isn't just a normal company deciding to up the prices of their products. This is a company that's almost built by the people who saw their work as a form of charity, as a way to help share information that they felt like makes the world a better place. And so, when Redditors caught wind of what had happened, they were outraged. It became global news, and many moderators of the subreddits, they started to go dark in protest, either by privating those subreddits or activating the not safe for work tag, so their content can no longer be monetized by Reddit. At the beginning of the protest, over 7,000 subreddits went dark, with some going indefinitely. Reddit then tried to calm things down by offering an Ask Me Anything with their CEO Steve Huffman, but his refusal to budge only enraged users more. He was constantly saying stuff like, "This is like a protest in a city that